Thank you all. I should open by saying I do have some visual aids, but as our friend Vint Cerf says, power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. And you should feel free to jump in, interrupt, and otherwise make trouble, even as what I have to say is unfolding on the screen. I've been thinking a lot about civic technologies, and I'll define that in a second. But I'm thinking about it especially in terms of the sorts of things that are central to Singularity University. We take Singularity University to be, in large part, about technological change and accelerating technological change. I think there are certain kinds of technologies that can surprise us. And the fact that they can surprise us is what makes them so special and important. And when I think of even a singularity, of course, there's the definition in the black hole, which is, it all boils down to a point, because gravity is that much crushing. But singularity, mathematically speaking, can also mean just that beyond which the equations cannot predict. It's a singularity in the sense that it asymptotically goes to something unpredictable. And that's sort of the technologies, again, that I'm interested in. Those things that take us to places that are unpredictable and how to keep those vital and alive. So with that, let me think a little bit about what civic technologies mean. When I say civic technologies, I don't mean technologies that are good for e-government. So it's not like, voting machines, yay. What I mean by civic technologies is a special kind of technology that will rise or fall depending on the quality of the people who decide to join it and participate in it, with the invitation being open largely to many, many people. And not many technologies are that civic. I mean, your refrigerator is not a civic technology. It will not keep your food any colder just because other people have refrigerators and are enthusiastic about how it works. And historically speaking, most of our major identified information technologies have not been particularly civic either. I know in these parts it's good to give a little historical sweep to things, so I thought I would do the same. This is Herman Hollerith. And in 1880, he was a 21-year-old Census Bureau clerk helping to tote up the total number of people in the country. What he had going for him was there weren't as many people then as there are now. But other than that, things were against him. It was an incredibly boring job. And Hollerith figured there had to be a better way to do this. And he was inspired by a couple things. On the left, the jacquard loom, which would weave depending on the kinds of holes present in large placards that would be run through it. One of these can actually be found partially reconstructed down the street at the Computer History Museum. He was also inspired by a standard train ticket where you might put a hole in the ticket to indicate the privileges or limits of the ticket holder. And that gave him the idea of coming up with this punch card, where somebody interviewing somebody from the census could punch holes depending on various qualities of the person they were interviewing as they find out answers. And then he came up with a machine that would take these qualities of male, female, foreign, all these kinds of things, and could tabulate them. You'll see a replica of that also at the Computer History Museum should you go. And this machine was basically genius. This is the kind of thing that in the 1880s, the 1880 census took just over 7 years to complete, dangerously close to the 10-year interval at which we do the census. Thanks to these machines, the 1890 census could be done in under 2 years. And his genius was not just limited to technology. That other earlier drawing was from a patent application, so I almost called him a patent clerk. And he had some good entrepreneurial sense. He actually decided to lease the machines necessary to tally the census to the United States government to the tune of $50,000 per machine per year. And that's $1890. That's like before dollars were something you paper a birdcage with. And that was an amazing move for him. But what it meant, aside from a great cash flow, was that he was being paid by the government to solve a particular problem. And it was his job to solve it. If the problem didn't get solved, they would know whom to call, and they might not pay him his money. But otherwise, it was entirely within his zone to solve it. And that principle held a certain vitality through from the punch card of the Herman Hollerith tabulating machine through to when he merged right after the beginning of the 20th century with 4 other companies and formed a new company which was later renamed International Business Machines. And after a brief detour into the sale of Browning semi-automatic rifles, IBM came back to its core mission of information processing, and this card in aspect ratio and direct genealogy is the parent of this card, the computer punch card that went in to stacks like these. And I don't know how many people have fond memories of stacks like these with like the diagonal line, so that if a friend of yours should throw them on the floor, you'd have some hope of reassembling them in the order in which they're meant to be fed into the machine. And when I say fed into the machine, it's machines like this, the IBM System 360, the powerhouse of the 1960s. And you look at this machine, and to me, this is a machine that radiates, "Don't come near me or you will die." And that is the essence of Hollerith from a century before. It's saying information technology ought to be managed by experts. We set up ahead of time the problem we want to have solved, and then it's their responsibility for that fee to solve the problem, which is not a bad model for solving problems. I mean, that was the workhorse model for so many decades, but it is not civic. While you could reconfigure the IBM System 360 to do any number of tasks, you, in that case, would have to be somebody wearing a lab coat and associated with the company in IBM in the basement of some other company who's the actual client, getting paid to do that, which meant that there wasn't a whole lot of whimsical programming invited by outsiders on an IBM System 360 because you would never get near it. Now, also in information technology during the 20th century, we saw another range of machines and technologies that were meant for consumers, but then weren't reprogrammable. So I think of things like the Frieden Flexowriter. If you remember a Flexowriter, you are definitely a senior information analyst. They looked something like this in their first incarnations during World War II, like a regular Royal typewriter, except you'd feed in tape along the side. And as you typed on the screen, on the keyboard here, it would appear on the paper here, but also make indentations on tape. And then you could feed the tape back through the Flexowriter, and like a player piano, it would type whatever was on the tape. It actually turns out it's far easier to do mail merge with cut and paste on a Flexowriter than it is with Microsoft Word. So, yes, extremely useful device. The kind of device that genealogically was the parent of devices like this. This is a Flexowriter from the 60s, starting to become like the smart typewriters you may remember in offices in the 1980s, where they'd have that one glowing line in the middle. Or maybe you had a Brother smart word processor in the 1990s. And this is meant for consumer use. When you turn it on, here's the main menu. Where do you want to go today? We have so much. There's word processing, spreadsheet, address book, etc., etc. But there's nothing called other. What you see when you turn on something like this, the Brother Smart Word Processor, it's the same the day you decide to get rid of it as the day you got it from the factory. And in that sense, not a generative civic technology either. This is basically a refrigerator for your words. So, okay, that's how it was looking in the information technology object kind of space. I feel like we had a similar trajectory going for us in the networking space. Some of you may remember back in the days from the 80s and early 90s, you might have been a subscriber to one of these services, CompuServe, Prodigy, America Online, or MCI Mail. CompuServe was actually based on modified DEC10s. That's why you had an octal user ID. Like, I'm 76703, 3022. It's like, that's user-friendly. But even with something like CompuServe or Prodigy, America Online, these were self-contained networks. You could communicate with other subscribers of that service. You'd pay by the hour, and not a lot of people able to program new stuff on those mainframes. What you saw when you plugged in and got the main menu of one of these services were what the managers of the services thought you wanted to see. They wanted it to be attractive to you, but there wasn't going to be any surprises. There is no kind of singularity towards which this technology was going. So a wrench was thrown into both the trajectories of endpoint devices, like Brother Smart Word processors, and networks, like CompuServe and AOL, by some surprising out-of-left field Civic Technologies that really weren't necessarily meant for mainstream consumers in the early days, but somehow ended up in everybody's hands. So in the network space, that would include the internet. Here are three of the founders of the internet, John Postel, Steve Crocker, and Vint Cerf, classmates at the same high school in suburban Los Angeles in the 1960s. I know, it's like we had a French club, they had a let's build a global network club. It's like, pretty good. And they're pictured here for the 25th anniversary retrospective of the internet, a Newsweek photo that took absolute hours to stage. And it's worth kind of taking apart. It's kind of like a Last Supper sort of tableau. And you learn a lot of things. First, that they're goofballs. Like, these are not, they're serious people, but they are playful people. And I'm not sure that IBM would be described in its heyday as a playful place, right? That's not IBM. The people at Brother doing smart word processors, like I'm not sure their office pranks were legion. It was just kind of a company. Here you have a certain kind of quirkiness that is a point of pride of the internet community that makes them no less serious, but certainly gives you a sense of their ethos, and also helps you to understand how people of this sort could generate a technology that would be described in its sister technologies later as the patent that never was. Herman Hollerith raced to patent the tabulating machine. These guys built something with no business plan, which is a rather weird thing to utter in the halls of Silicon Valley, right? They had no business plan. They had no CEO. These guys get together in an organization called the Internet Engineering Task Force with no president. Their motto, should they have one, is we reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code. Like that's weird, right? It's very strange how it's going about. And that kind of ethos of playfulness, so playful, by the way, that their network doesn't work. It goes from ear to ear and then mouth to mouth and then ear to ear. I've been assured by Vint that this is a inside joke and like we're in on it rather than that the framers of the internet don't know how to string tin cans together. But yes, sir?
Yeah, I'm unclear. What's weird about that ethos?
What's weird about it is that it is an outlier ethos to the kind of technology that is the lab coat kind of technology. And that when you build a technology, you really do infuse your values into it one way or the other. And the values they infused by being playful and goofy and not necessarily focusing on how to monetize it had a huge impact on the network that resulted, which is why you could have so many competing networks. And in the standard model of market competition, it's like if there's some better way to build the network, great, one of these guys is going to figure it out. That's how competition works. And yet they basically all had the same crap and then competed on price. That was basically how that worked. Here is where you get the one that is different from all the others. And there's certain ways in which you can identify it as different. So here you have MIT connecting to a network through BBN, and then it goes through, showing this idea of piggybacking. That so long as you can reach anybody already on the network, you're as good as on the network yourself. And all we need to do is design the protocols so that we burden BBN as little as possible with the fact that MIT is connecting on. You have no desire to measure even the most basic things that you would need to measure if you were trying to build a network and make money with it. What are the classic things on CompuServe or Prodigy or AOL? What's the very first thing you see as soon as the modem is done connecting? What do you see next? Say again? Login, the prompt. Right, who are you? You must authenticate before you can come into the service. Why? Because they need to know where to send the bill. And that also means they can charge for different services. Now you're entering the cost double enter area. Please enjoy, right? And here, they had no concept of that because they didn't need to send anybody a bill. That wasn't on their minds. So they end up, how do we just get things networked together? And you're not presented with a main menu. You're just on the network. They presume you're going to figure out why. Why are you here? That's up to you, pal. You know, surely you have somebody with whom you want to communicate. Get going. You're now on the internet. Very different from the main menu authenticate yourself model, which is why to this day we have no idea how many people are attached to the internet. CompuServe, AOL Prodigy could tell you at any instant the exact number of people who were subscribers and the numerator, how many of them were logged on. Here, they couldn't tell you at all. Can you count IP addresses? Yeah, but you know, the state of Qatar shares one IP address among everybody, as Wikipedia found out one day when there was some vandalism, and they finally, even Wikipedia finally blocked somebody, and it turned out to be the entire state of Qatar, which was awkward, to say the least. So, not easy to know how many people are online because no need to monetize. But it also led to a certain kind of flexibility that meant the network could grow organically and start doing unpredictable things. Now, I think in your materials in the network and technology session, you were treated to a little diagram of the 7-layer cake. It didn't look as appealing as the serving suggestion on a Duncan Hines box, but it was basically, here's the network layer, and all the way at the top, there's applications. This is another way of looking at that layer cake by making it an hourglass. No more appealing either, if you wanted to eat it. But the reason it's an hourglass is because the design they had was to make an internet that could work on any medium. It would be medium agnostic. We don't care. As long as you're bringing hardware to the party that eventually can speak internet protocol, it's not up to us to figure out what that hardware will be, which is pretty amazing for the framers of internet protocol not to want to worry about the hardware. Somebody else will come up with that. And then up here it's broad because they're not caring what you do with it. Again, they're pairing 2 people up or multiple people up. You guys can figure out how you want to communicate with each other. Is it World Wide Web? Great, Tim Berners-Lee, go invent the web. You know, good luck with that. But it outcompeted Gopher and Weiss and all these other things that we no longer have heard of, because there's a space where you can come up with a new application and there's nobody to whom you submit it to get it approved. It's as good as on the non-existent main menu as any other application there, and you just publicize it and you see how many people join along. The only narrow part here is this, and oddly IP here does not stand for intellectual property, it stands for Internet Protocol, and this is the glue that keeps the ends of the hourglass together. And that glue basically functions, with some license taken, as a crowd surfing kind of mosh pit, so that you end up as a packet getting passed around from one node to another, and eventually getting there, as if I wanted to get this laser pointer to the back of the room. If I want to get it back the CompuServe way, it's basically like FedEx. We pay somebody to take the laser pointer back. I know who they are, they know who I am. They take the money, they take the laser pointer. If the laser pointer doesn't get to where it's going, it's registered, we complain to them, et cetera, et cetera. Totally rational way to move stuff around. The internet way to do it is to say, we are the change we've been waiting for. We're ready to lead, however you want to say it. Pass the pointer, pass it back, and eventually, like this, it gets to where it's going. Yes, sir?
So does a mosh pit also deal with congestion by dropping packets?
Does a mosh pit deal with congestion by dropping packets? It certainly can get to be too crowded, and that's what leads networking, both in a mosh pit and in internet networking, to be called best efforts routing. It's like, we're not promising that you're going anywhere. It's like send it and pray, or every packet an adventure. And yeah, that's like sometimes there's packet loss in a mosh pit, which is just try again. Like, you know, you can't complain to anybody. So in a way, yeah, the metaphor holds. Now, this is kind of a crazy way to do things. I really think it's counterintuitive, which is why you didn't see anybody else doing it, except for these experimentalists funded and operate under a very different ethos. And that's why people are fond of saying that there's doubt as to whether the internet could actually work. IBM, as late as 1992, was saying you couldn't possibly build a corporate network using internet protocol. You need one of our saner proprietary solutions. And framers of the networks themselves sometimes say the internet is just a pilot program. Like, the jury's still out. So far, so good, but you know, ask us in a year. We'll see if the internet actually works. And that's why they say their mascot, if they had one, would be the Bumblebee. Because the fur to wingspan ratio of the Bumblebee is said to be far too large for the bee to be able to fly, and yet, somehow, wonderfully, the bee flies. And, turns out thanks to massive government subsidies, we finally figured out how bees fly. They flap their wings very quickly. Yes. Who would have thought? So what we end up seeing then in the 1980s is a sense among the technologically advanced network people in the consumer space. It's just like, who's going to win this horse race? Maybe it's the source. And then suddenly they start to get displaced by a whole set of services and projects tied together by internet that starts to get its own momentum going from unpredictable corners, started often by non-incumbents, right? Started from who knows where, with variable profit and profit models, each able to be accessed by anybody on the network. That's a civic technology, and one that takes us to surprising places that are very difficult to calculate ahead of time. Sometimes not great places, just ask any intellectual property content holder of the Hollywood variety. Sometimes amazing places, as I'm sure all of us can think of examples. Now, for these civic technologies, as they get very popular, they fit a certain pattern, which is that they can fall victim to their own success. Because kind of like, I don't know, Burning Man, to use an example popular out here, almost everybody I talk to about Burning Man who has been is like, yeah, but this year it's really going downhill. There's too many people kind of know about Burning. We need a different Burning Man that's like the new Burning Man, the way it used to be before, right? Basically the marginal point at which you knew and could go, but nobody else knew. That's the point at which Burning Man was at its best. And so there's a similar phenomenon here, where a system that depends on a certain amount of trust, like the mosh pit, as more and more people join, they're like, this is a great way to get from here to there. I don't have to pay anybody anything. I just jump on and away I go. And they don't quite get the ethos. It starts to stutter. And a couple bad apples can actually wreak pretty big havoc. And this is true of the very fabric of the internet itself. So, case in point, in other work that I do, I study internet filtering around the world, times that governments try to block their citizens from getting to certain stuff. In 2008, there was an order from the Pakistan Telecommunication Authority to block certain sites. This is not that unusual. They actually at one point asked that YouTube be blocked. And that meant Pakistani ISPs had to figure out how to prevent their subscribers from getting to YouTube through the whole mosh pit thing. So how did one small Pakistani ISP choose to implement the mandate to block? Well, this gets back to our metaphor, because when you're crowd surfing, you don't specify a destination. You're not like Brooklyn and step on it. You're just like going around. The internet needs to know about a destination, which means it needs a map. It needs to know when a certain packet arrives to a person, does it go this way or does it go that way? And for that, there has to be some sense of labeling and destinations and where things go. Those are called routing tables. And the routing tables aren't accumulated in one central map. They could be, but they're not, for good reasons, but they tend to be distributed. So it's almost like in this room, we just do a little bit of gossip every so often. And what happens is any one of you could turn to the person on your right and exchange credentials. I see, this is who you are. Well, this is who I am. And then you turn to the person on your left, you do the same, and then you say, and by the way, this is who I saw on my right. And then they say, this is, to their left, who the person to my right saw on his right. And before you know it, through effective gossip, you have managed to have a decent enough map of the internet that packets can get where they're going. The only thing is, like a good civic technology, it relies on the gossip being honest. This takes us back to our story. How did this one ISP at Pakistan Telecom decide to block YouTube? It started gossiping to itself and to others that it had just discovered that it was YouTube. Who knew? But YouTube was right under it. And what that meant was subscribers' packets would come in aiming for YouTube, and they would stop there and be thrown away because the point was to block YouTube. But then, within moments, what happened was that, so this is the beginning moment. Now here's the next moment. Just within 2 minutes, through gossip, more and more ISPs were starting to relay their traffic for YouTube through this Pakistani ISP, which was, again, throwing it all away. And you end up then here with basically around the world, if you wanted to get to YouTube, you're sitting at NASA Ames wanting to get to YouTube, your packets were going to Pakistan and they weren't coming back. Now that's weird, right? So how is it that within just a couple hours, everything is fixed? Well, here's how it didn't happen. There was nothing in particular that YouTube or Google, the most popular website in the world, owned by the most powerful company in the world, could do about the block. So how did it happen? Well, you end up with NANOG, the North American Network Operators Group, unincorporated, no president. It's like a message board for people who like non-proportional fonts. And they exchange messages with each other. They're like, oh, looks like YouTube's down, and this is a case of IP hijacking. It's, not YouTube engineers doing something stupid, etc. And some of the NANOGers, who aren't limited to North America, work at mid-level as mid-level employees at ISPs. And they're exchanging best practices. I'm like, this seems to be a problem. Here's how you can manually reconfigure your router so that it ignores the bad, spurious data. Here's where the real YouTube is. And through comparing notes, they get it back up and running. It's a civic technology that had evolved a civic defense system. So metaphorically speaking, it's like if your house catches on fire, the bad news is there's no fire department and you don't have a hose. The good news is that neighbors and strangers come by with their own hoses and water, put out your fire, and leave. And you're like, to whom do I write the check? Like, nothing. It's fine. I'm trying to think, like, what's the right metaphor for that kind of help? And I don't know. It's kind of strange, right? Like, how much can we rely on this to keep our core civic technologies afloat? But once you start seeing this pattern, you can see it in lots of places. So Wikipedia, it's the hackneyed example of people coming together in a civic way to try to produce something larger than themselves. But I think it's too easily thought of as just an enterprise that runs almost anarchically, where just random edits are made and eventually the right ones win for most of the articles, and there you go. But in fact, there are people who are defending it as it got popular, as it became the top hit on Google for Name Your Subject. It's the kind of thing for which, if you're a spammer, why wouldn't you change every Wikipedia entry to an ad for your Rolex watch? You're already the spammer that's responsible for 90% of the world's email being spam. Like, it's not conscience that's going to stop you from going after Wikipedia. And the answer is, they are trying their best 24/7 to turn every page on Wikipedia into an ad for a Rolex watch. What stops them? What stops them are people who just don't like that, and they hang out often on the administrator's notice board, itself a wiki page that anybody can edit to bring a problem to the attention of others. So here's a typical day's catch on the administrator's notice board. Let's see, we have, tendentious editing by user Andy VFill, and user trilemma, what happened, Anon attacking me for reverting, my favorite, a long story. And as these problems get loaded in, more people are there dealing with the problems and attacking them than there are problems arising. And it's that kind of, to date my own cultural references, it's like the Lucille Ball show episode where they're at the candy factory and they're working on the assembly line, they're just hoping to keep up. It's like if at any point there's more problems than there are problem solvers, things start to get squirrely. I can't help but think that if there were a particularly popular Star Trek convention sometime, drawing a huge critical mass of Wikipedians away from their basement warrens, Wikipedia would stand defenseless. And within 45 minutes, it would be toast. So, very unusual civic defense system solving some of the problems of a civic technology that arise once it has become popular. All right, so let's talk about one more piece of the puzzle here, which is the personal computer. Personal computer, in my view, starts in left field every bit as far out as the internet from the consumer mainstream, both in intention of its framers and in its noticeability. So this is a 21-year-old Steve Jobs introducing the Apple II personal computer at the West Coast Computer Fair in December 1977. For the first time in a convenient single-molded plastic case, you had a machine that you could buy for under $1,000. You could take it home. You could plug it into a television set. And what's the first thing you see once you've powered up your Apple II? Blinking cursor. Blinking cursor. This is kind of like the reprogrammability and inscrutability of the IBM System 360 paired up with accessibility of the Friden Flexowriter. You exactly don't get the login prompt. It's like, okay, where do you want to go today? But it's also like he assumes you'd have some idea of what you wanted to do. And if you were the kind of hobbyist he had in mind to buy it, then yeah, 10, print hello, 20, go to 10. Hilarity ensues. Like, this thing is great. Marge, come take a look. Like, whatever. But it also meant that if you had particularly good programming talent, you could write software and then share it or sell it to anybody else that had an Apple II, and Apple had nothing to say about it. They're like, great, glad to see you guys getting together. So that's why within 2 years of the introduction of the Apple II, Bob Frankston and Dan Bricklin invent VisiCalc, the first digital spreadsheet ever. And businesses around the world are like, OMG. Apple IIs are flying off the shelves. And it turns out Apple has no idea why. They have to commission market research to figure out why their box got so popular. Completely different from the IBM way of market research and responding to needs, and then we design something, we see how it works kind of thing. That's a generative civic technology intended for many more modest things than it ended up being used for. And that's why this basic architecture that we all know ended up in the years less Apple II and more Microsoft. Here, I don't know, what vintage would we put this? What year would people say this is? I hear 85, I hear 86. 92. I think it's 92. 1992. But we're all dating it. There's like, I have a winner. But it's Price is Right rules. You have to get as close as possible without going over. So many people notice the 66 Lite.
Actually, it has a CD-ROM in it, so it's probably a little later than 92.
Oh, could be later than 92. But again, didn't go over. So 66 Lite, and there's a button next to the 66 Lite. You press it, it goes into turbo mode. Prince of Persia, twice as fast. And it's like, why don't you always want the computer in turbo mode? And I guess, well, Prince of Persia twice as fast, but also the hamsters inside get tired running on their wheels. And I am actually pleased to say, I know NASA has a required green content now for each talk. They actually now have a hamster-powered paper shredder. So the hamster runs on this wheel here, and it shreds the paper as the hamster runs, and the hamster can then live in the paper afterwards. So anyway, you have a machine architecture from 77 through the 80s and 90s through 2007, which shares this amazing feature that's analogous to that amazing hourglass on the network side of things, which is you hand this thing the code, it runs the code. No questions asked. That's why it's like an hourglass with a PC in the middle, a PC operating system. I don't care if it's Windows or GNU Linux or Mac OS, because all of them at the top are broad, and they will run any code you give it. And your computer you can buy for one purpose. You probably had something in mind when you got the computer. But you can then repurpose it for something else as easily as double-clicking on something. Nobody buys a computer to make their hamster dance. But once you have the computer, it's like hamster dance is only one URL away, and you're like, I had no idea. This thing is great. But now we get to the same problem of falling victim to its own success that we have seen in the network space with the Pakistan YouTube example, and that we've seen in the Wikipedia space with the vandalism examples. Here, I don't care, again, what your platform is. You are at this moment, if you have a PC open, running huge stacks of code. And I don't care how geeky you are. You have absolutely no idea what any of these things does. And that is a problem. Because it could be that any one of these happens to have a line in it, if it's crude, that says delete the hard drive, at which point your hard drive gets deleted. That's pretty weird, right? Anytime you click on something and you get one of those boop, boop, like security alert, red alert, you're like, whatever, it's Friday night, I want to see the hamster dance, and you go forward. You are trusting at any moment that it doesn't say delete the hard drive or slurp all the data back or go into spreadsheets and transpose some numbers at random and then go back to sleep. Your work is done. 3 weeks later, you're doing payroll and you're like, what? Right? Very weird that we live in such a precarious situation. And I feel then like somebody describing the possible attacks on Border Gateway Protocol that the YouTube example represents before that happened. You're like, you know, any ISP anywhere could just lie about anything and suddenly the entire world would buy it? That's weird, right? And until it happens, people aren't so sure. But this is exactly the state we're in acceleratingly popular general purpose civic technologies. So I see articles like this, unpatched Windows PCs, if you just plug it into the wall, 4 minutes later, it has been compromised. Like you're still trying to figure out how to get the patches loaded in. It's too late. Your men are already dead, Sergeant. Here's an article from Network World in late 2007 talking about the storm worm and how it's fighting back against researchers that seek to destroy it. It launches denial of service attacks against them, shutting down their internet access for days. As you try to investigate storm, it knows and it punishes. It fights back. They're afraid. I've never seen this before. And you're like, am I reading Network World or a discarded script to 24? Like, this is weird, right? And our defenses against it are slight, to say the least. This is a wonderful and timeless email sent to Harvard Law School faculty and staff about an insurgence of fraudulent emails at the law school, for which, if you click on the wrong email at the wrong time, that's it. Your entire computer is compromised. So we have a list of things you need to know before you so much as dare to read an email. My favorite warning of which is this: be weary of emails that have misspellings, poor grammar, or odd characters. They are a red flag for fraud. I wrote back, I was like, I think I got one. They sent me to Oxford for 3 years. So the fundamental problem is best expressed by this: the Capn Crunch bosun's whistle. Prize in a box of Capn Crunch cereal in the early 1970s. After you've sugared up your kid, why not have her run around the house with a whistle? It's like perfect partners. But now, it turns out that if you cover up one of the two holes of the bosun's whistle and blow, it emits a tone at 2600 hertz, exactly the tone used by AT&T, the monopoly telephone provider network in the US at the time, to indicate an idle line. Pick up the phone, dial a long-distance number, blow the whistle, free long-distance telephone calling. Yeah, right, like power to us. Take that, AT&T. It's weird, right? Boxes of Capn Crunch cereal flying off the shelves. General Mills is like, what? Yeah, new third-party application for our cereal. Who knew? But now, AT&T could fix that because AT&T's network was not meant to be civic. They were supposed to have a FedEx-style network. They just had poor security on it. They had no out-of-band programming. Instead, the channels of communication were also the channels of control. So there was some sound you could make, protected through obscurity, that could reprogram the network. So they're AT&T. They fixed it. They just, promulgated a new patch so that they use out-of-band signaling. Problem solved. The internet is at exactly this phase. The same channels that carry our emails and our tweets and our music are also the channels that carry executable code, whether for the network itself or for our reprogrammable endpoints. And we wouldn't want it any other way. It's meant to be a civic technology. If you tried to have a computer that couldn't be reprogrammed at all from afar, it wouldn't be a computer anymore. But that starts to point towards some of the solutions coming out as this problem is getting worse and worse and as business models are shaping up more and more for the exploitation of these endpoints and for having zombie armies. Now, some of this was seen as recently or as early as 2003, in which Richard Clarke drafted the National Strategy to Secure Cyberspace, an incredibly thick document, the first half of which was, we're in big trouble, the second half of which was, I don't know what to do about it. Their most concrete suggestion was to create a number of information sharing and analysis centers. Here's the one for IT. They've got this like very complicated analysis center. I think that's either Steve Case or Jack Bauer. And, you know, at some point they're like, the internet's down, what do we do? It's like, we should tell people, we can't, the internet's down. Like, this episode brought to you by Procter & Gamble. It's like really short episode. So you start to see other ideas getting floated around. I had a colleague who's not very much into IT, but I think is very prescient. He said, you know, we license our hairdressers. Before somebody can come near your hair and wash it, they need to be licensed by the state. And we don't feel that we live in like Soviet Russia. It's like, you know, we're still free. That's just a consumer protection thing. So if we're willing to license hairdressers, why shouldn't we license coders whose behavior could far more impact the safety of the world than one bad perm? And I was like, like that's an awful idea. But I was like, why is that an awful idea? I know that's an awful idea. But you start to realize that we're actually moving towards just this kind of world if we don't solve the underlying security problem arising from the civic technology. Yes, sir?
Look in the bottom left-hand corner of the licensing, you'll know why it's a bad idea.
Jeb Bush governor. We need licensors we can trust. And who will license the licensors? As Homer Simpson says, I don't know, Coast Guard? It's like, that's not satisfying as an answer. Yes. So we actually start to see movement in the network space. The International Telecommunications Union, whose logo I think rivals that of NASA in its kind of retro approach, originally founded in the late 19th century, the time of Herman Hollerith, to regulate the provision of telegraphy and cryptology over that. Pay no attention to the disaster occurring outside. And the ITU has since become a UN member organization. The members of the ITU, it's not like the ITF, it's like there's no such thing as membership. Here, the membership of the ITU are states of the world. And their original job in the network space that might be the most public-facing is they assigned international prefix dialing codes. So it's the ITU through its democratic processes that decided the United States would be 1, and Ecuador would be 593, and that Motorola would be a country, thanks to Iridium. So they have a very formal structure, and they've come up with something called the Focus Group on Next Generation Networks, also known as the FGDGN. And they are putting together an alternative to this bug-ridden, worrisome internet. Here's their initial chart of the next generation network. It may not be as elegant as an hourglass, but it's got so many more features. All the measurements that CompuServe and Prodigy had that the internet lacked make a return here. There's media resource control function, et cetera, all so that a given piece of data can know whether it wants to be moved. It's like, I want to send it, you want to receive it, but it does not want to budge, and the network should respect that. For copyright reasons, for classified data reasons, you name it, privacy reasons. That's what the next generation network is about to be, because it will identify senders and receivers, and then we know who the bad apples are. And I love how there's this little brown box here called Internet. It plugs into the internet over here, nothing to see. This is the next generation network. And on the computing side of things, we see a similar evolution, I believe, away from this architecture that has given us so much, but that also is now so problematic from the 30 years after which it was founded. We see a movement, for example, of the PC towards what I would call information appliances that are internet aware. Remember, the internet is ecumenical. It'll take anything that plugs in and speaks IP. So your TiVo can plug in and start speaking IP. And even though your TiVo might have GNU Linux inside screaming to get out, your remote for the TiVo is a remote. And that's basically how you operate the TiVo. Very, very, very few people have figured out how to hack their TiVos. And I gotta say, it voids the warranty. So it's like a dangerous thing to do. And there's a whole range of devices that are of this tethered nature, where even though you hold it in your hands, how they behave can change over time. It's not like the Brother Smart Word Processor, but the only way it changes over time is not because you program something or Dan Bricklin programs something like VisiCalc. It's because Amazon on the Kindle chooses to send it a software update. And that power, which is just so routine, turns out to be incredibly fundamental. It's how Amazon can announce a Kindle that will read books to you through an experimental text-to-speech feature. The publishers have a small cow over it. Amazon backs down, sends a software update to your Kindle that makes it more reticent about reading books. Or in an amazing incident that could not have been more textbook, we see somebody start selling 1984 through Amazon. People download it to their Kindles. It turns out there's rights confusion. It's in the public domain in Canada, but not here. And the entity selling them is like, oops. And Amazon is like, uh-oh. So what does Amazon do? It reaches in to each Kindle and deletes 1984 from the Kindle. And you're just like, huh. And they're like, I'm giving you 99 cents back. And you start to realize that there's an entire range of products that are near and dear to us, like the iPod, and yes, like the iPhone, that share this characteristic. Now, version 1 of the iPhone was a clear case. 2007, iPhone gets released. Steve Jobs makes no apology. He says, we define everything on this phone precisely, right? The man who gave us the Apple II knows best. He's like, believe me, well, you do not want what I gave you 30 years ago. Instead, you want something that exactly does not act like a PC. Now, the world begged to differ. A number of people, many fewer than I think the popular press has reported, started jailbreaking their iPhones. And an independent software community was desperate to code for this phone and not happy with Steve Jobs' suggested path of just make it a web page and the iPhone browser can get there. That didn't cut it. So within a year, we see Apple introduce the Software Development Kit, which makes people very excited around the world, although this is not, in fact, a real Newsweek cover. So now it'll be a little bit like that PC from 1977. Somebody can write software that isn't Apple, and it can end up running on your iPhone. The only thing is, huge asterisk, how does it get there? It must go through the iPhone Apps Store. That entity must be approved, indeed licensed, not by Jeb Bush, but by Steve Jobs. And then, once licensed, submits the code for approval in a somewhat opaque process. It either gets approved or it doesn't, and then made available for people to download. Oh yeah, and Apple takes a third, 30%, of whatever you charge for the app. It's like in Bill Gates' wildest proprietary monopolistic dreams. He was never deducting 30% off of any software sold for a Windows platform. And he was never trying to stop people from giving software to other people. At most, think how quaint it is. He was trying to control whether Netscape would appear on the desktop when you took it out of the box. That was the thing that got the world obsessed with the Microsoft case for a decade. And now you look at the iPhone App Store, all pictures of Steve Jobs blurry, and here's his slide saying what the limitations are. Illegal, malicious, privacy, porn, bandwidth hog, and my favorite, unforeseen. No singularities on the iPhone. Now, what does that mean in practice? I worry it's the worst of both worlds, because software developers, especially the playful young nerds who don't read EULAs, but just they're all friends that have iPhones, so they code for the iPhone because that's where the fun is. They'll still code and can get stuff on, but then the interesting, angular stuff gets picked off one at a time. So just one case in point. This was an application called Freedom Time before the elections last year, counting down the days, hours, minutes, and seconds until Inauguration Day of 2009, quote, till the end of an error, and rejected by the iPhone App Store. And the author of it writes, he says to Steve Jobs, he says, I just want to let you know what's being rejected. It's not defamatory, harmful, speaking untruth. You know, it implies some critique, but it's not crossing any lines of decency. You know, what's going on here? He says he gets a message back. Even though my personal political leanings are Democratic, I think this will be offensive to roughly half our customers. What's the point, Steve? And you realize that by creating platforms, in part in the name of convenience and simplicity and security, to solve a very real problem, that have gatekeepers who have to be told what the point is before they'll let it fly. They're like, this does not look like a bee that will fly. Then anything Angular gets knocked out. If I write an app that lets an iPhone talk peer-to-peer to any nearby iPhones, so that if another Hurricane Katrina passes through these environs and there's no ISP, but actually I have an app that we can pass from iPhone to iPhone, and our iPhones can talk to each other until it gets out to the margin of the area, and then there's an internet connection. Now we're all loosely on the internet. No way that gets into the iPhone App Store. That's a bandwidth hog. Yes, sir?
That actually is on the iPhone.
That is on the iPhone? I would love to see it, and the slide will go right here when you show it to me. Ping. I will look for Ping, the iPhone app, or anybody online right now is welcome to look it up. I don't think it's point-to-point either, but I want to give him enough rope. Anyway, so we'll look up Ping and see what happens. Now, my belief is that one kind of silly app that we'll never miss at a time, we get ourselves into a space. First, where we take this model on the iPhone and we spread it throughout. I don't think this is about mobile phones. This is about stability. And at some point, we're going to realize, why are our computers so utterly unreliable and resource-intensive to maintain? If I could have a computer like a refrigerator or like an iPhone, of course I'll take one. And suddenly, the default is grandma no longer has the descendant of the Apple II on her lap. And that's a problem, because now you can't give grandma Skype very easily and say, just press the button, grandma, and then we can talk for free, because she doesn't have the infrastructure through which to do it. And this is not just our endpoint devices. I mean, this is a question of where code will run and who will get to control it. And there's a lot of excitement about cloud computing. Maybe if you just give me a browser, fine, my code will be in the cloud. But the places in the cloud where stuff is happening are places like Facebook apps. If you're a nerd of today, you're going to write an app for Facebook, and then Facebook either approves it or doesn't, can retroactively kill it, can choose to charge for it later. That's explicitly part of the Facebook developer EULA. And now you have another point of control. And in fact, almost any of the major platform-oriented services that are so new and colorful next to the dowdy services they replaced long ago with CompuServe and Prodigy are themselves amenable to this kind of gatekeeping. I think about it in its most basic form, almost like a toaster that's Web 2.0-ified. What's a Web 2.0 toaster like? Well, it's like, here's the toaster. You come back on a Tuesday morning, and it says, congratulations, you've got the fall update. You now have 3 slots. You're like, well, that's cool. And you go to work, and you come back, and it's an unhappy face on it. It says, we're sorry, there were problems in the toaster update. We rolled it back. We apologize for any toast that was crushed in the rollback. You're like, okay. And a week later, you come down, and it's making orange juice. And at this point, you're like, what did I buy? You didn't buy a toaster. You didn't buy anything. You have entered into a long-term service-oriented relationship with a breakfast-oriented provider. And they are going to do their best to figure out what will please you when you wake up and are hungry, and it may or may not agree with what you want. And that is a weird form of control, not just because of the power it gives the vendor, but because now the government has just a handful of phone numbers it can call in order to accomplish any regulatory end it wants, previously not so easy with a Civic technology. So some examples of that. I don't know how many people are familiar with TiVo. Probably a lot of people have TiVo, digital video recorders or something similar. EchoStar made a counterpart DVR. It's the dish system, but it has DVR functionality. TiVo, in the meantime, gets sued by Gemstar for patent infringement. After many years, TiVo wins, at which point the hunted becomes the hunter. TiVo immediately turns around and sues EchoStar for patent infringement. They sue them in Texas, Beaumont, Texas. Motto, plaintiffs always win. TiVo wins. EchoStar loses. Owes TiVo approximately $95 million in damages for patent infringement. So far, just a normal run-of-the-mill case, nothing to see here, folks. But the TiVo lawyers are very smart. They ask for something more, and they get it. They get an injunction from the judge ordering EchoStar within 30 days to disable the DVR functionality in all but 192,708 units of these infringing EchoStar DVRs. In other words, congratulations, you've received the fall litigation update. You now have a brick. That's what the judge was ordering EchoStar to do. Bonus question to figure out why some arbitrary small number of them would be spared. Here's the answer. I actually had to call the lawyers and get them to tell me under the Chatham House rule. And the actual answer is that part of the damages were for lost sales of TiVo DVRs, sales that didn't happen because EchoStar was there as a competitor in the market despite infringing the patent. At that point, when EchoStar has paid, they've bought those VTRs from TiVo. Like now TiVo has earned money. So to fry them would be double dipping. So those EchoStar DVRs should be saved as if they were TiVos. How do you decide which ones to save? My idea, essay contest. Why not? Why I should have my DVR spared. But this is a remedy that from a legal point of view is unremarkable. Of course you can ask that the infringing objects be destroyed. It's like a warehouse full of knockoffs, burn them. But it's totally new. Because before, if you bought a mousetrap and it was infringing some patent, maybe the maker of the mousetrap goes down with a $90 million judgment, but the patent police don't kick in your door saying, do you have any mice traps? And you're like, I don't know. So example number 2. Some people may have OnStar bundled with their General Motors or other vehicle. Some Volkswagens have this as well. It has GPS functionality, turn-by-turn navigation, a little rearview mirror with a button in it. You press the button and a little voice comes over the speakers. Hi, how can we help? There's even an emergency button. You just speak into the rearview mirror. You say, help, help, I've fallen and I can't get up. And this lady, this is the actual lady, will send help. Okay, nice feature. FBI gloms onto this feature. And it sends the administrative paperwork over to a company that offers OnStar-like services. And it says, there is a car containing people of interest to the FBI. We want you to send a firmware update to that car's system, simply turning on the microphone in the rearview mirror. And at all times, anything said in the cabin of the car gets fed automatically to the FBI. The company, as you might guess, had a small litter of kittens and then did it because they could. They then turned around and filed suit against the US government saying that this exceeded the authority of the FBI under the Wiretap Act. They did so anonymously for obvious business reasons, leading to the wonderfully captioned case, The Company versus the United States of America. I am not making this up. The company loses in the district court an opinion under seal. It goes on appeal to the Ninth Circuit. We have no idea what will happen is the motto of the Ninth Circuit. And the company wins on the thinnest of reeds. The opinion says that the company wins because the so-called minimization requirements of the Wiretap Act are not met because the way the FBI asked for the system to be programmed, it goes to the FBI at all times. If the people in the car actually fall and can't get up and ask for help, it goes to the FBI, which presumably will not come and help. So that's a problem. If you can make it so it goes to the FBI at all times when you ask for help at conferences in the lady, perfectly legal under the law of the Ninth Circuit. How often is this happening? We don't know. We don't have the right to know. No member of Congress has asked for data. We don't know. We just know this one case that got through because the company got worried. And it's not just OnStar, you start to realize. You start to realize that within this room are a bunch of devices that are reprogrammable at a distance by their vendor in a privileged way for which your cell phone mic could be turned on remotely, not when you're in a call, just as an ambient microphone. And you suddenly realize that through our consumer preferences, we have built a surveillance-capable state with just a few orders that would have otherwise taken years to build. Now, I don't want to bring up 1984 again. It's like hackneyed. There's a Godwin's law for using 1984 to describe a privacy invasion. The best I can say here is it doesn't really apply because in 1984, there was a screen in the house and you knew what it was for. You could go in the corner and whisper. Here, it's a little more subtle and worrisome. So it shows to me the flip side of civic technologies. It shows that when there are technologies that can move ahead or change drastically without having that barometer of public adoption and acceptance that is the hallmark of a civic technology, you can have changes affected in society that don't have the safety valve of the public saying, enough, we won't take this anymore. Yes, Salim? In your opinion, how extensive is this literal phenomenon?
That kind of the government eavesdropping separate.
My guess is we have not yet hit the knee of an exponential curve of this becoming routine. I think it's probably rare right now. Why do I have that instinct? I'm not sure. It's not that data heavy because the data itself is secret. But supply creates demand. You just know that with this opportunity and how easy it is to listen in, why would you possibly want to do a black bag job and pay people to sit, you know, with the like ill-labeled truck outside that's like Max's Donuts and the alligator? It's like, why would you possibly do that when you can do it some other way? Yes, sir.
So estimates suggest 30% of personal computers are owned by someone else. They're
Yes.
bought it. And this, in theory, was done by crowds of teenagers.
Yes.
In Ukraine.
What if the teenagers happen to be working for a state?
Well, isn't it hard to believe that some state intelligence agency hasn't thought of that?
Well, we have some examples, and in certain footnotes, I've put the examples we have in chapter 5 of the book from which this was drawn. The FBI had a program called Magic Lantern, which was basically run-of-the-mill malware managed to be put on the machine through hook or by crook, for which then the FBI would have pwned the machine instead of the teenager. The interesting thing is they went to Symantec and asked Symantec not to allow the Symantec antiviral engine to notice Magic Lantern. And last I knew, Symantec had said they would do so. I don't know if you have a thought on or an update on that.
Yes, which is interesting because actually the Russian antivirus maker Kaspersky explicitly said that they would and will detect various government eavesdropping.
And it's true that you can always trust the Russians. Sorry, I had to say that. But it's like I might want to run like 8 different antiviral things at the same time, except then they start fighting with each other. They're like, Symantec is trying to access the internet. You better stop that. So the way I think about this is that there has traditionally been an element of civic support needed for major law enforcement undertakings. Like in modern times, it would be a drug driving screening. They start pulling over tons of cars on the 101 to do a screening. One of the reasons that is said to be constitutional, even if they're pulling you over without any probable cause, it's just part of a dragnet to test for drunken drivers, is that if they go too far, the public will throw out the sheriff. It's just so visible. But here, of course, it's much less visible. And in the past, it calls to mind the concept of the posse. Before law enforcement became so specialized, became so removed from the people with whom and for whom it was enforcing the law, you would have, if you needed to do a major enforcement, the sheriff would gather together a posse, right? We've seen High Noon. We know how this works. You call able-bodied lads to come together to enforce the law. And this actually became very significant because in the late 19th century, an accommodation was reached among political elites between North and South having to do with the return of fugitive slaves. And the North said, we will return fugitive slaves to the South. That's part of keeping the Union together. It turns out that this law, in practice, was dead letter because the Northerners, when assembled for the posse to go find and return somebody, was like, I'm sorry, I have to shampoo my cat. Like the posses just didn't materialize. And that's because there was a civic dimension to such an intrusive law in order for it to be into effect. And it was, in fact, that civic dimension that saved us from the immediate effects of the law rather than the rule of law itself, because the rule of law is what gave us the Dred Scott decision. So to me, the question is, how can we deal with the very real problems occasioned by civic technologies in the mainstream that have not yet organized a civic defense system, without turning to architectures that seem appealing at first glance, but that are so closed and controllable by a concentrated set of parties that it amounts to the license to code that many of us may have instinctively worried about, and that unduly allow for government regulation. That's what I'm concerned about. And maybe, you tell me, Salim, I can offer a few thoughts on that, or we could open it up to discussion right now. I know we're kind of running late generally today. What's your pleasure?
Let's hear some thoughts.
A little bit more?
Yeah.
Okay. So one thought I've had is that we ought to try to cultivate civic defense configurations for those technologies that have yet to attain them. So that includes two organizations of which I'm a part, both nonprofits, StopBadware.org and the OpenNet Initiative. The first, which is tasked with dealing with the malware problem in a way that isn't just the Patriot missile battery, shoot them down of Kaspersky and Symantec and everyone else. And second is the OpenNet Initiative, whose purpose is to track what previously has been unmeasurable because the internet was not built with measurement in it, to show internet blockages around the world of the sort that I mentioned when talking about the Pakistan example. And for each, what I aspire to is a simple dashboard on your screen where you can devote some of your general purpose PC's cycles and bandwidth to working on each of these problems, and a little bit of your own knowledge if you've got any, and then in exchange, you will be given a readout that bears on these problems. So we've created a project called Herdict, as in verdict of the herd, worst name ever for a project. Particularly bad because we chose as our icon the sheep. And sheep come in flocks, but we couldn't bring ourselves to call it Flockdict. So at least it's not that. So if you have ideas for names, we're all ears. So this is the PC herdometer, where your PC relays its vital signs back anonymously to other members of the herd. So you actually get a sense for the health of the overall network, meaning the health of the stuff attached to it. And you start with playful things like hard drive space. You know, where in the histogram does my hard drive size fall, or my processor speed? And as each day goes by and other people upgrade, you can see your computer getting crappier and crappier. You know, that kind of thing. And eventually you can start to say, I'm about to double click on the dancing hamster. Do I want to do this? And you can ask a simple question of the herd. How many self-identified experts in the herd click on the dancing hamster versus the rest of us? And very quickly you'll see that some software that many people click on, the experts steer away from. And that gives you news you can use of the sort of like a two-wheel drive, four-wheel drive switch in your car. You need to know a little bit to work it, but it's not rocket science. And the same thing for filtering. I did some of the first studies of internet filtering in 2002 in a systematic fashion, and was interested in finding ways to basically crowdsource that, which has given rise to a project called Herdict Web, where in Herdict Web, as you're surfing around, if you can't get somewhere, you can push a button and say, I can't get there from here, what's going on? And the act of asking the question helps to answer it. Because as more and more people say, I can't get there from here, what's going on, we can start to figure out who's getting there and who's not, and start to infer, is this a country level ban, an ISP level, a corporate level ban? NASA doesn't want people looking at the European Space Agency. You can start to learn about various kinds of filtering in real time as it happens. This system went live in February. It now exists not just in English, but in Chinese and Arabic. We have Farsi coming online shortly, and soon to have Russian. And the basic idea appears to be working. Does it get blocked? Short answer, not yet. Our first milestone of success built into the business plan is when are we worth blocking? We know we've done the others, when are we worth gaming? And we have plans for that, which I can disclose at a later time, but there's an app for that. Recently, Herdict picked up reports of Amazon.com being filtered in China. And the Wall Street Journal picked it up and went to Amazon. Amazon said, everything's fine. I don't know what they're talking about. They came back to us. And our project manager, without talking to me, was like, we stand behind our anonymous crowdsourced reports. I was like, we do? And before I could retract it, it turns out Amazon was being blocked in China. And Amazon didn't know it. And then they came around and were like, yeah, we're being blocked in China. And so especially as we have these debates about network neutrality and other things, I'm hoping we're bringing on the tools that, like the civic defense systems of Wikipedia, of Nanog, are starting to show how we can, without needing to be rocket scientists ourselves, start to have some knowledge about things. Yes, Salim?
Assuming you've chatted with Ethan Zuckerberg at Global Voices.
Ethan Zuckerman is a fellow of the Berkman Center,
Yes.
where Global Voices was hatched.
Okay.
So yes, we've been talking to him. So a woman named Casey Kinzer in early this year did a weird project called Tweenbots. She took cardboard robots, put a smiley face on them, put a Radio Shack simple motor in them that made them just drive forward at a slow but constant rate, and then put a flag on them with a desired destination in the first person. Please help me, I would like to get to X. Then she released them on the streets of New York City. Now, I don't know, my hypothesis might be that people would call DHS. Like, this is weird, right? Instead, people helped get the robots to where they were going. Here is one robot released in the northeast corner of Washington Square Park. After the intervention of over 40 people, it got to its destination in the southwest corner. In Boston, she'd be in jail. There was that. Well, that experiment was done at Logan Airport, a big no-no. But yes. Yes, exactly. Yes, Star Simpson is the MIT student that ran a more ill-fated test project. Now, I don't know, we can draw a number of things from this. Certainly, if somebody went to commercial with this, it's tweenbots.com, and it's like, you're just supposed to help stuff get out of this way, but you don't get a cut. That might not work so well. Although people do Yelp, so go figure. But you see other phenomena taking place, like crowd surfing, couch surfing. And my guess is in the heart of Silicon Valley, right? How many couch surfers or people who know of couch surfing here? Right? A number of people. Almost everywhere else, you would never get over 50% of the people knowing about it. This is a civic technology that has all the features of a bee that should not fly. Right? Dan Hoffer is like, I've got it at last, a service that will pair up people who want to sleep on a stranger's couch for free with strangers far away who would like someone they don't know to sleep on their couch for free. It's like, damn, why didn't I think of that, right? And yet, couch surfing starts to take off. And it's pretty incredible. Now, it will face its own civic defense moment as criminals find out about it and use couch surfing to steal stuff or worse. And there'll be some moment where there'll be the couch surfing killer. You know it. Fox will report it. How couch surfing deals with this is exactly the generative civic pattern that I've been talking about for all these technologies, and they know it. They're working on nanogs and other reputation-based systems not to compromise the decentralized nature of it, but to try to make it reliable. And as I think about just how popular this is so far, it's exactly that kind of unexpected singularity that itself is riding on top of a network for whom you didn't have to persuade Steve Jobs, what's the point? So there was a time in the 50s, the time of the Flexowriter, that like it was perfectly sensible to hitchhike. Like you could actually hitchhike, and it was like, that's fine. Given the age dispersion in the room, how many people have hitchhiked before? Right, a lot of people. How many people have hitchhiked within the past 5 years? Burning Man does not count. Burning Man is outside the space-time continuum. But right, that's weird, right? What is it that turned this bucolic, if bored scene into this? And I mean, partly it was popular culture, but it's also just a few incidents and a few bad apples, and then it's like, we're all going to CompuServe, don't leave the door open on your way out. And yet, I then take hope. I see in Craigslist, there's like a rideshare board. And you're like, there's a rideshare board? Like, isn't this hitchhiking? And you're like, no, 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 you know, criminals don't plan ahead. They're not on the internet. No, wait a minute. What? It's been reframed. It's rideshare. And until there is a Craigslist rideshare killer and accompanying movie with Rutger Hauer's son, no problem. That's the hope that civic technologies can keep springing up, even as we like them for a while, but then abandon them very worried. In North Korea, The radios by law must be programmed so that they can receive only 3 stations. Like, that's it. The Kim Jong-il Reflection Hour, the Kim Il-sung Party Hour, and Rhythm and Blues. Like, that's all you can listen to. Your radio cannot get any other frequencies by law. So they actually have this project in South Korea to take radios that are of the standard variety and solar powered and float them across the DMZ so that the people in North Korea have some hope of a technology that is not utterly tethered to the desires of a vendor or the government that controls it. My hope is that as we see the value, the amazing success of the civic technologies among us, and see our own signals inviting our participation, that we will rise to that call and spend a few cycles or bits or moments trying to help keep that human fabric together so that we don't have to trust others to police it for us. Thank you very much. Thank you. A few questions, if people are up for it. Over in the corner?
I'll wait for the mic, although I can project without it. You touched on this very briefly, but I'm wondering if you can go into a little bit more detail regarding the civic support needed for these civic technologies and what happens when the supporters, the enthusiastic fans and users, want to turn a generative technology into a locked garden.
I think it's worrisome. I think it's a natural instinct. It's kind of the there goes the neighborhood view that they revel in their insularity and don't see a need for the rest of the public to join them for the ride. And it's not a phenomenon we see explicitly in something like Wikipedia, but I think it is implicitly there. It's why Wikipedia has seen the need, from starting with only one policy, they multiply them as they need them, to have a policy that's like, don't bite the newbies. Like, you want to welcome people in, even if they're not doing things the way you think they should. You can't own an article. You need to let other people contribute in certain ways. And of course, Wikipedia gets criticized from both sides for like not being elitist enough, being too democratizing in who it lets contribute, where a PhD has to argue with some random 12-year-old as to why this is the way the article should be. But I even look at the fact that Wikipedia has as its primary interface, should you choose to edit an article, a non-proportional font, sui generis, bizarre markup language for which you're trying to figure out how many equal signs you need to make the indentation work, and then you say, to hell with this. And that actually drives people away. Now, I think, kind of like ham radio licenses, it's meant to keep out the riffraff. If you can't figure out how to edit a Wikipedia article, all the better that you go on and move right along. There's a hamster dancing for you somewhere. And I think a nice litmus test that would bear on the future of Wikipedia, which is currently undergoing a kind of strategic visioning exercise, and for which, by the way, I do not think Wikipedia's centrality and future is at all ensured, not just as a brand, but as a general mode of even producing something encyclopedic. I'm very concerned about its future, despite its current success. And I think one of the biggest tests will be, it's out there for anybody to do, write an API on top of the Wikipedia bizarre non-WYSIWYG front end that makes it so you can call up a Wikipedia article and edit it as if you are sitting inside Microsoft Word, and then click send, and it makes the change. At that point, you would have a step function change in the number of potential contributors, and I think a number of Wikipedians would be queasy about that, thinking they can only absorb so many tourists at a time. They don't want Hong Kong to annex China. They want China to annex Hong Kong, to utterly mix my metaphors in one paragraph. The other big test would be, I believe that in our dysfunctional and boring and bored schools, where kids are basically warehoused for days at a time, twiddling their thumbs and learning their ABCs, the act of learning how to contribute to something like Wikipedia, how to justify your beliefs to others, even if the others aren't that rational, how to band together and form factions within and around an article so that you can actually get something done, and how to not trust everything you see. All of these skills, I think, are vital to future generations, and it's why Wikipedia ought to be utterly central to many of the exercises kids are asked to do, and I believe the opposite also to be beneficial, that those kids flowing into Wikipedia are a sort of labor force that can keep it going and keep it going in the spirit of not having money change hands, that might be a way of preventing it even from, at some point, raising the drawbridge. So that's one example carried through of your overall statement that yes, sometimes these generative communities like to stay off in the corner, and if they see themselves getting too successful, they will change their name, they will all abandon it for something else because they just think it's for them. And it's also, by the way, why many of the nerds that I talk to about the security piece of this, the cybersecurity piece, are disproportionately unconcerned. And I genuinely believe it's because I've got a shotgun, I can protect my own house, digitally speaking. If they're too clueless, they don't know what to click on, maybe they should get an iPhone. And I believe that is systemically a very short-sighted point of view. Peter.
Jonathan. So let's have some fun. 10 years, 20 years down the line.
Yep.
We're spending this week here talking about artificial intelligence, robotics, human-machine interface, reprogramming human genomes. Take this down the path where we've got society reprogramming human thought and human genomics. And what have you thought along those lines?
Well, I think it raises structurally the question of, do we want all technologies to be civic, the way I've been defining it? Or if it's a spectrum, are some technologies better being less or more civic than others in broad categories? And of course, how we would define those categories would be interesting too. Do I want, and as you can tell, this presentation was very rah-rah Civic Technologies while trying to be sober about the dangers. But I think about, do I want to have a maximally generative and civic chemistry set available in our K through 12 institutions or to the public at large, that anybody can brew up a bomb? And it's just like, well, you know, we'll just have to come up with a way to deal with bad apples. It's like, I don't feel as confident in the zone of chemistry that I want a civic technology where anybody can innovate instantly.
We used to be able to do that in the 70s and 80s.
Yes.
Do whatever you wanted.
That's true, but in the 70s and 80s, it had its own insularity of the homogeneity of the community that would bother to do that. It didn't have to hit that stage of falling victim to its own success and drawing the attention of those who would use that capacity to experiment not as an end into itself because experimentation is fun, the way that hacking used to be, but then start to use it as a means to some other ends. I think the same about physics. I mean, there was a wonderful New Yorker story I encountered while I was researching the book called The Boy Who Built a Nuclear Reactor in His Shed. It's like, you don't even have to read the article at that point. It's like the trailer just kind of writes itself. But it's like, all right, you know, there are some technologies so sensitive with impacts so profound, especially if they are viral impacts, if it's something that you could click and spread it from person to person. I mean, if you get into the zone that I think we've been thinking about in these environs, that truly start thinking of the human mind as software running on hardware and we can download it fairly interchangeably with arbitrary hardware and that kind of thing, it's like, I don't know if I'd want anybody to edit it at any time and trust that others will come along and, you know, I'll be number 14 on the list of problems to solve and someone will solve it. But then you still get into all these questions of, all right, well then who does watch the watchers and who would we put in a position of responsibility there? And that's why, despite the fact that I have almost not at all mentioned law, either in the answer to your question or in the entire presentation, this is a cyber law issue and it's a cyber law presentation because it's Lincoln's questions at Gettysburg. It's like, are we capable of governing ourselves? And what are the mechanisms by which we do that? And sometimes we do it in very formal ways. We have that vote in the House of Representatives and we open up the electoral college votes and we count them one at a time with everybody watching. And at other times it's much more industry self-regulation, or let's just trust that on a given subway car, somebody isn't going to run around and try to hurt everybody. That's why we don't have a cop in every subway car. Each technology and technological system probably will call for its own system for creating and maintaining some semblance of order amidst the desirable chaos. And I just don't mean to pretend that the same size will fit all. And as we start to think about the human mind as the software, I start getting much more nervous about a civic technology alone, and would start instead thinking about what forms of civic checks can there be on more formalized control systems, or formalized control systems as a check on the civic system. That would be where I'd start to dig in. I don't know if you have other thoughts on that, or others have thoughts on this question.
We have remarked during these days sometimes that it would be desirable to have actually policy discussions beforehand, so that when the technologies emerge, there is some thinking already, where should policy go? And to me, it looks like that we have had what we wished for, but it doesn't really attain our goals, as we have the secret negotiations, multilateral negotiations of ACTA, the anti-counterfeiting trade agreements,
Yes.
which to me look perfectly attuned to prohibit 3D printing
Yes.
technologies
Yes.
to be ever made available to
Yes.
consumers. And by the way, they are also fixing and patching
Yes.
things looking backwards by outlawing fair use, mandating
Yes.
criminal punishments for DRM,
I get it.
et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
So how do you think when you have these kinds of global dealings
Right.
behind the scenes of any democratic oversight,
Right.
what should citizens do?
Well, there's the easy answer with something like this ACTA example of, you enforce more transparency. You ask why this is a secret negotiation. You say, fine, have your secret negotiation, but don't expect when something emerges from it that it just gets rubber stamped. It would have to go through some process. I mean, this is how democracy is supposed to work, and it's why it's probably no surprise that a major colleague of mine in the cyber law space has decided to repudiate most of cyber law and move into corruption, and democratic systems is his next area of study because of the tight relationship that you're noticing too. But what I figure is that that's not as much a story for our purposes about the dangers of government regulation as it is pointing out that once interests are established, cash flows are happening, and things are less likely to surprise us. We think we know what the alternate futures hold. That's when you start to see public choice issues and gaming of systems, and the interests all just start writing checks to get what they think will be the winning configuration for them. That then pulls it back to Peter's question, because I think so many of these technologies are still deemed by most people as remote enough that you don't yet have everybody around the table looking for his or her piece of the pie. And if the communities that coalesce around getting these technologies off the ground and trying to think about their uses and how open or generative they'll be and what limits there should be, kind of as problems arise, but within a fairly constrained community that has its own set of ethics, that can start to set the pattern and the stage that others will have to rail against later. That's my way of trying to solve the problem of so many of these technologies basically have two phases from a regulatory standpoint. The first is too early to tell. You don't want to regulate yet. Let the thing breathe a little bit. And then the next stage is too late to do anything about it. It's like, well, now it's understood how it's going to be. You can't possibly upend copyright at this late stage or upend the structure of the internet at this late stage. And that's why I'm aware that some of the processes out there, of which the next generation network that I showed you the slide of is just one. Stanford has a clean slate project. AAAS and MIT are doing a let's rethink it from ground up. And it's just so hard to do that self-consciously because you know how this ends. And so it has such a different feel from the early design days of the internet, the way the documents and the participants portray it, because precisely we know the stakes. So the fact now that we don't exactly know the stakes, we just have this sense that this could be big, I think puts extra responsibility on the people bringing it about, who believe enough in it to be turned out in a room like this to talk about these new technologies, to be thinking through the policy and ethical implications. Because better that the enthusiasts kind of sort out some stuff early than waiting for the regulators to come in later and do it. Yes?
The biotech community took a crack at this in the mid-'70s at the Asilomar conference. What do you think about that approach? We now have a hybrid of self-regulation and government regulation.
Well, my sense is it could certainly be worse, right? Like, I'm not sure the world would be better off had that process not happened. I don't know your view on if you think somehow there's innovation that hasn't taken place that should have taken place because people have been too fearful of what's inside Pandora's box. What's your sense of that?
Certainly the stem cell problem was somewhat unrelated to the concerns that those people had.
Yes.
At Asilomar, that was sort of religion related.
Yes.
But I think that the Asilomar folks really basically got it right. And
Yes.
the innovation has been quite substantial.
Yes.
And has not been severely hampered
Yes.
by their original guidelines.
Yes. And I think, too, then, we're looking at a process that did not emphasize utter concern about stakeholder representation. It did not formalize every category of stakeholder that must be at the table, and then either a noisy consensus-oriented process where it gets watered down so much that you got nothing at the end, or a vote. Oh, we eked it out by one vote because that guy went out to get pizza, so like we win.
Right.
And many of our decision-making processes that we think are needed to do something as important as affect a policy have those qualities to them. Either they're these consensus-oriented, heavy process stuff, or it's we take a vote, we have either a member of Congress or you're not, and when you're there, here's how the rules work. So I like approaches that try to run down the middle of that don't get so obsessed with process, that basically, we reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code. Right. That's the hope we place in that form of policy
They were
setting.
working backwards from first principles.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Over here?
So hi, Ted Zucker. So we have plebiscites and we have policy that's done in various ways.
Yes.
And yet I wonder how long are any rules, no matter how you come to them, useful? And what are some examples of what's rough numbers of rules that last forever or don't? And how do you kill dead rules and who kills them?
In the technologies I've been studying the most, rules are almost after the fact. They exist. You can hear Wikipedians citing chapter and verse. This is POV, this is NPOV, and there's all sorts of other rules now. Wikipedia has a ton of them, including a rule that says, don't let the rules get in the way of building a great encyclopedia. For which then, the codicil to that is, if you find yourself invoking this rule, you are probably wrong. There's a reason the rules exist. But these rules in Wikipedia are instantiated and applied one editor and administrator at a time. There is an arbitration committee, an ARBCOM, that's supposed to render judgments when there's a real dispute, and they have this evidence production. You see them inventing the law of the U.S. courts, one painful step at a time. I was at Wikimania 2003 at Harvard, where for the first time ever, the ARBCOM was in the same room. And it was oh, the ARBCOM is here. And people would be giving comments hi, my name is John Smith, also known as, Sender 14. Oh, that's Sender 14, wow. And it's amazing to see them recognizing each other. But all this is a long way of saying, even when the ARBCOM renders a judgment, there are so few judgments they make in a year, and there's millions of controversies. And even once they make the judgment, it has to get enforced. And it doesn't magically. There's not US or Wikipedia marshals enforcing it. It's just there are editors who believe in the system. And then even if they were against that outcome of the rule, but they lost through the consensus process, they will then enforce it. One of my favorite examples is Star Wars Kid. Some of you may be familiar with Star Wars Kid. He's the guy that took a golf ball retriever and filmed himself with a handy cam, swinging it around in an extremely embarrassing way, and then didn't erase the tape and gave it back to his school from whom he had borrowed the cam, and his friends found it, put it on the internet. It's one of the most popular viral videos ever. Not happy kid. Like, at no point did he embrace this. He did not go on Letterman. He hasn't made a Subway ad, you know, blah, blah, blah. And the Wikipedia article about it, there is one, of course, doesn't name him. And on the discussion page that is attached to every single article, this is where you talk about the article if you're one of the editors or just curious, has a huge debate over whether to name him, because the mainstream media named him. You could Google him pretty quickly. And it's like, this is a fact. Wikipedia is about facts. We put the name in. And other people were like, no, I don't think you should put the name in. It's like not material to knowing about the phenomenon, and his parents have specifically said he doesn't like it, and blah, blah, blah. It goes back and forth, and as you read it, you get persuaded back and forth, and eventually they decide no name. And to this day, there is not his name in that article. That's like just Wikipedia's stance on it. And the people who were against it, who wanted his name there, abide by it. So all of this is a long way of saying it's less about the essence of the rule, the way a lawyer would smith it to get the right words in sequence, the right exceptions, followed by the comma, that then get litigated in a court that discusses whether the comma is where it should be and all that kind of stuff. And it's more about apprenticing to the values of the space. And by the end, you believe enough of the values that stuff gets done, and enough of the meta values that where you conflict on the values, you have a way of resolving the problems. And the losers don't feel screwed. They feel like they lost. But okay, they'll win next time. Until the culture changes, which is why it gets back to the question about there goes the neighborhood. It's why Wikipedians want to titrate the arrivals, because if Stephen Colbert sends a bunch of them, it's like these people are not wanting to apprentice to Wikipedia. They're wanting to edit an article about an elephant. Get out. And I don't think this is just Wikipedia. I think many of these phenomena, including the internet protocol community, there are rules. You know, one of the worst things somebody can say to somebody else in internet protocol land is, that is not RFC compliant. You know, RFC 1591 clearly says that this is how it gets done, and that does not match the RFC. But it's like much more a way of doing things and a spirit to which you apprentice and you absorb, which is just also like you think of the rules of politeness. And, you know, I don't mean to say chivalry so much as just the ways in which you interact with people in a seminar environment, on the street, that are shared enough that you feel okay when you walk down the street. You feel like you're helping someone else. And those are rules worth cultivating, not in the lawyerly sense, but in the sense of shared values that get revisited all the time and that must evolve. You know, Segway comes about, you need to evolve your rules. Does it go on the sidewalk? Does it go on the street? Answer, unfortunately, appears to be none of the above. No Segways. But in a way, maybe that's why it's one of the things that contributed to Segway not really catching on the way its inventor had hoped. It's that there wasn't the community use case, the thing that would get it going in a way that made it feel like it fit in the community.
So what you're saying, sorry, what you're saying really is it all works because we're more of a pack animal than we are a predator as a race.
Although when I hear pack, I finish with lemmings. And it's knowing when to let something slide so that not everything becomes a fight, but also knowing when to stand up and say, wait a minute, so that you don't see the pack get pushed or turn and end up in a direction or a place that it really is not wanting to be. So it's a weird, when I think of pack, I want to think of a group for which you feel identity with the group. Doesn't mean you always listen to the group. It doesn't mean you run in sequence. But it means that if the group is hurt, you feel wounded too, which is why you might pick up litter in your own local park, because it's your park. It's the community's park, but you'll just pick up the litter and, you know, fine. You'll unvandalize the page, because when Wikipedia gets vandalized, you get vandalized. And that's also what I think makes Wikipedians harder to buy off. There's a website called subvertandprofit.com. Anybody seen this website? Subvertandprofit.com allows you to buy digs at $2 a dig. $1 goes to Subvert and Profit. The other buck goes to a random digger who otherwise just digs as he or she always would and occasionally gets the secret message that says, go click on this uninteresting article and we give you $1. And they get the $1. And I think it's in a way because diggers don't necessarily, it's not like that's your identity. If a digger had to list 20 things about him or herself, dig would not be on the list. If a Wikipedian had to list 20 things about himself, Wikipedia could be there. So that's the sense of pack. but I worry about the other baggage that comes with our normal conception of PAC.
So, you know, Wikipedia is interesting, but one of the things that most concerns me about your insight is the fact that more and more things have microphones. And it's not just your cell phone and your computer, though I do want to note that I can't take my battery out of my iPhone. Other than pulling the battery out of an application, it does concern me that people say, assume my refrigerator, my clothes, everything I'll be able to interact with.
Everything will have OnStar.
Exactly.
Right.
So talk about removing your privacy. Not to be a 1984 freak, but how do we counter the Big Brother getting into our business?
Well, the Big Brother stuff, it has at least one element of easier rather than harder to it, which is that we kind of know the template. Like Richard Nixon has done us a favor. We know how this works. And it still may mean they have more tanks than we do, or the law doesn't come to help when it should. But we basically do have decades of experience in building a society that is sensitive to civil liberties. It gets tested sorely again and again. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance, et cetera, et cetera. But we know how to make the rule of law more or less function. We know when it is not functioning, and we can call it out. So long as we've got sufficient transparency. And it's like we have freedom of information laws. So there are governments that are aware and that are imbued with characteristics that are designed to restrain those very governments. It's why the OnStar case raises, to my eye, Fourth Amendment issues. And I believe, in fact, was wrongly decided by the Ninth Circuit. And wearing another hat, I would try to write that persuasive brief to the Ninth Circuit. At least the Ninth Circuit, those were decision makers that weren't the FBI, that don't get paid by the FBI. You know, so there are ways to help and build governments that try to be inured from it. And the only worry is that if the sine wave is of increasing amplitude of when abuses happen, just how far they can go before they get reined in, if these technological infrastructures let them run much farther, maybe they go off the edge. And that is a worry. It's why, in part, I would be in favor of building technological infrastructures that have technological limits on abuse, not just legal limits. When Amazon promised after the 1984 incident that they were changing their policies so they would not do this again, I'm like, well, that's great, but we need to figure out how to build a Kindle so that you can hook it up to a computer and back up the contents. And we can even have light DRM. This is not an anti-DRM rant. It's like, I just need to know that if you get ordered by the government with the gun pointing at you, I don't care about your new policy, you're killing 1984 right now, or you are excising this copyright infringing or defamatory passage, that I've still got my backup. And ditto for Google Books. We need to have it so that when a book has a canonical copy in the cloud, and a library of tomorrow doesn't have rotting stacks of paper in the hopes that somebody might one day want to take it out, but rather terminals and printing on demand that get to the cloud copy, we need to make sure that that cloud copy integrity is not challenged. And at the moment, there's no real plan for that. It's like, well, why would that happen? It's like, well, I can write you the warrant that would insist that that happen, or the judicial ruling. There are ways around this, and it's actually a nice function for libraries where they can actually download their own copy. Occasionally the copies compare against each other, a checksum, and where there's been a tweak, suddenly we're aware of it. So some technological ways of dealing with it. It doesn't solve the problem of peer-to-peer privacy invasions. That's where I thought you were going with your question, about if there's a sensor or a microphone in everything. This is why now, if you really want some kicks, go back and just look on YouTube with a search term of angry teacher or road rage, and put that together with basic facial recognition, and it's like, you'd better be on your best behavior at all times, because that indiscretion you just had where you flipped off somebody on the road, or the kids finally got to you and you told somebody to, you know, sit down and shut up, that's now possibly going viral. And I believe it is imperative to come up with some systems to allow almost Creative Commons style for the conveyance of preferences and statements that relate to privacy as much as for our assertions about copyright, so that I have a fighting chance as something is going viral to be like, by the way, I am Star Wars Kid. I'm not identifying who I am, but I am Star Wars Kid, and let me write you about 10 lines my essay on why I would rather you not forward this video. I'm not telling you you're going to go to jail if you, or I'll sue you if you don't, but please don't. And some people will forward it anyway. They might be more likely to forward it. They're 4chan people. That's what they do. But I don't know if there's a critical mass of 4chan people. And I almost ask each person in the room, give yourself the Star Wars kid test. If there were some framework by which you could experience that preference just after you watched the video and got a good kick out of it, and you're about to hit send to decide whether to forward it, but you have on good authority an easy way of linking up to his preference, would you still forward it? This is not easily amenable to a poll because there's social pressures in how you answer the poll, but my hope is that that would actually eliminate the viral nature, that enough people in that circumstance would not forward because they then can see themselves in Star Wars Kid. It has brought the humanity back to what otherwise is a disembodied, funny video, that they would not. So
Great.
Thank you again.
With that,
thank you all. See you on
Jonathan,
Facebook.
thank you very much.